what's up everyone? Welcome back to Babel on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Samach Gimel, Daf 63 of Masechta Yoma. Interestingly, I filled up another notebook with notes, which is pretty cool. I guess notebooks are for notes, and I have loyally filled up another notebook with notes, which is pretty cool. I didn't even realize it snuck up on me, so I'm going to have to find another one for tomorrow. But anyways, Daf Samach Gimel is it's a real daf of Gemara, you know. We continue our discussion of Shehutay hutz. We're going to see three opinions regarding slaughtering, specifically a korban pesach, really outside of the azara, based on, of course, our discussions yesterday about slaughtering the sar l'Hashem and sar l'Azazel outside of the azara. Then we move on also to the sugya of mehusar zeman, particularly in the context of the sa'ir la'azazel, the sa'ir mishtaleach. If you could set aside an animal to be a sa'ir mishtaleach if it is less than 8 days old, because the pasuk says you have to wait until an animal is 8 days old before it can be offered as a korban chevre. These are the sugyas we're going to be learning about today. These are real, very sugya-y sugyas, so with some real machloksin. So everybody get ready, because we're getting started. When Samach Gimel Amud Aleph, 3 lines into the page, Umi Islay Rav Chizda Ho'il. Does Rav Chizda really hold of Ho'il? Chevre, who can explain that to me? What this means is that yesterday we had said that when it comes to the 2 goats, the Sar l'Hashem and the Sar Mishtaleach, so we said that if you set aside 2 goats and then you slaughter them before the lottery, before you do the lots, so you're going to be chayav for Shehutay hutz. You're going to be chayav for slaughtering a animal that's hektish outside of the azar. Now the question is why? You can't actually offer either of these animals yet because it's pre-lottery. So they're not ready to be slaughtered, and there's still more things that need to be done. So if Chizda says, well, since even in their current state, they could be offered as part of as a korban musaf on Yom Kippur, so therefore they can be considered chayiv for Shehutay hutz, that they are able to be offered in the Beis Hamikdash as is, even if not as part of the service of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, but as part of the korban musaf later that day, and therefore you'll be chayiv for Shehutay hutz. So we see that Rav Chizda's opinion is that, well, yes, even though you're not going to use them for the Sar l'Hashem and Sar l'Azazel, but Ho'il, since you can use them in a different context, so it's okay. So we can consider them to be shaykh to the Isser of Shehutay hutz. So now the Gemara wants to know, does Rav Chizda really hold of this concept of, well, Ho'il, since we could say X, therefore we'll have some kind of consequence? Umi Islay Rav Chizda Ho'il, does Rav Chizda really hold of Ho'il, that since the Amar Rav Chizda, but Rav Chizda says, Pesach sheshachto b'chutz Bishar Yemos Sashana. Ha. Chevre. Remember back to Masechta Psachim. Of course, we know that a korban pesach that is slaughtered on any day of the year other than the 14th of Nisan is not offered as a korban pesach. It is offered as a korban shlomim. Pesach Bishar Yemos Sashana Shlomim. So the Amr of Chizda says Pesach sheshachto b'chutz b'shar yemos hashana. So if you have a korban Pesach and it's not erev Pesach, it's some other day, which means that it's not on any other day. It's not offered as a korban Pesach. It's offered as a shlom. So now you have a fellow who slaughters a korban Pesach some other day of the year outside of the azar. Of course, we also know that they would slaughter the korban Pesach in the azar, but this fellow, he slaughtered the korban pesach outside of the azara on some other day. Lishmo potter. So if this fellow slaughters a korban pesach as a korban pesach, well then he's potter, because it's not actually a korban pesach. I mean, you got to slaughter it as a shlamim, not as a pesach, if it's not erev pesach. So therefore he's potter, because he was slaughtering it as a korban pesach, which it isn't, and it was outside of the azara, but it was basically the wrong animal, the wrong korban. But if you slaughter it as a shlamim, then you're chai, because you can actually offer this animal as a shlamim, and therefore you should be offering it in the Beis Hamikdash, and you offered it outside of the Beis Hamikdash, chai. Time of the shalol lishmo. So now the Gemara says, wait, so the only reason that he would be chayav is if he slaughters this animal as a shlamim outside of the azar. Hastama, nishma ufater. But if he didn't have any particular intention, he just slaughtered the animal, so then we'll assume, well, what's he slaughtering it for? Well, it's a korban pesach, so Mistama's intention is to slaughter it as a korban pesach, and yet it's not erev pesach, so therefore he's basically slaughtering it as the wrong animal, and it's outside of the azar, so he's potter. But ve'amai, how come? After all, I thought Rav Chizda is the one who says hoil. He's the one who says that by the Sar Lashem and Sar Mishtaleach, that even though the lottery has not yet been done, but since they could be used as a korban musaf, therefore you're chayav for shehutay hutz. So why don't we say the same thing over here? Why don't we say that according to Rav Chizda, since these animals, since this korban pesach could be slaughtered as a shlamim today and be chayav for shehutay hutz, why don't we say that? Why are we saying that by default, if he doesn't have any specific intention, whether to be slaughtered as a korban pesach or as a korban shlamim, we default to being a korban pesach, which is what he had initially set it aside to be, and therefore as a korban pesach, outside of the 14th day of Nisan and outside of the Azara, we're going to say he's potter. But since he could slaughter it as a shlamim and be chayav, so why don't we say that? Ve'amai, how come he should be potter by default? Why don't we say, well, since he could slaughter this animal as a shlamim inside of the azara, he should be chayav for shehutay hutz. Chayav, you get the kasha, right? What do you think about it? It's a good kasha, right? Obviously. Let's go weiter. Boom. The Gemara says it's different. It's different. When it comes to the korban pesach, b'shari mos hashana, you actually have to change what kind of korban it is. It was a korban pesach. In order to offer it as a shlamim, you have to change. You have to have specific intention, like, hey, this isn't erev pesach, and therefore I'm not slaughtering this as a pesach. I'm slaughtering it as a shlamim. And as long as he doesn't have that specific intention, we're not going to change it for him. And we're still going to assume that it's a korban pesach, that he's slaughtering it the same pesach, and it's outside of the azar, but since it's shari mos hashana, it's not actually a korban pesach, because it's supposed to be a shlamim, but he's not doing it the same shlamim, he's doing it stam, so therefore we treat it as a korban pesach on the wrong day, and therefore he's not going to be chayav for shehutay hutz. Now, this is as opposed to the shnei seirim, that even though they're pre-lottery, since to offer them as a korban musaf, as a chatas, as these seirei chatas, you wouldn't have to change anything, because the goats that are offered inside the azara, right, the sari lashem, is a chatas, and the musaf is a chatas. So you don't have to actually change anything. And that's why Rav Chizda is willing to say ho'il, that since you can offer them as the korban musaf, therefore you'll be chayav for shehutay hutz, which is not the case when it comes to Pesach b'shari mos hashana, because there you actually have to change it from being a korban Pesach to being a korban shlamim, and we're not going to do that without your specific intent, and therefore you'll be chayav. No, therefore you'll be potter for shehutay hutz if you have just stam intention when slaughtering a korban Pesach b'shari mos hashana outside of the azara. Let's go weiter. Where am I? Where am I? V'amai lemaho v'roi shelo l'shmo b'fnim. Hachi ashta osam b'yakir aylo b'yakir v'iter. Rabba bar Shimi masni lu b'derabba v'kashla derabba adrabba. Umeshani k'dishaninon. Rabba bar Shimi parenthetically says, rather than talking about Rav Chizda all over the show, it's Rabba. So Rabba is the one who said yesterday that since you can offer these korbanos as a korban chatas for musaf, therefore you'll be chayiv. And also we asked the kasha about shehutay hutz by korban pesach, whatever. Or any place where it said Rav Chizda, you could swap in Rabba. Okay. Same question, same answers, fine. Kiyosar Rav Dimi, chavre. When Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, Rabbi Yirmiyah, Rabbi Yochanan, he said in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah, who said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Pesach sheshachato b'chutz, a korban Pesach that you slaughtered outside of the Azara, b'shayim Mos Hashana, the rest of the days of the year, so not an Erev Pesach, ben lishmo b'shin ben shelo lishmo, Potter, says Rav Dimi, that a korban Pesach, not on the 14th day of Pesach, on some other day, 14th day of Nisan. That's funny. I think I kept on saying in Pesachim also 14th day of Pesach. Alright, what can I tell you? Guess something is pre-wired in my brain to do that. Let's go weiter. So, Potter, you hear that? That a korban Pesach, the rest of the days of the year, when it should be offered as a shlomim, if you slaughter it outside of the Azara, whether your intention is for a korban Pesach, which is the wrong korban because it's not Erev Pesach, or whether your intention is for a shlomim, which technically is the right korban because that's what it should be offered for, you are potter for slaughtering it outside of the Azara. Rav Dimi says Rav Dimi Amrisa the Shmaita Kamed Rav Yirmiyah, and says Rav Dimi that he said this halacha in front of Rabbi Yirmiyah, and he asked the following question. He says, "Bishlama lishmo the halacha zilei." He says, and Rav Dimi says, "Look, I asked Rabbi Yirmiyah. I said, hey, I understand why slaughtering a korban Pesach on some other day with the intention of a korban Pesach, which is the wrong korban, and you do that outside of the Azara, I understand why you'd be potter. The halacha zilei. It's not fit to be a korban Pesach. It's not Erev Pesach." Then Rav Dimi says, but what I don't understand is that if I slaughter this korban Pesach on some other day of the year with the intention of it being a korban shlomim, and we're saying that I'm potter if I do that outside of the Azara, I don't understand that. Why? Why should I be potter? After all, it's the correct korban. It is a korban shlomim, and I'm doing it outside of the Azara. I should be chayiv for Shehutay hutz. You hear the kasha? V'omarli, and Rabbi Yirmiyah said to me, Akira's chutz lav shma akira. That uprooting the name, i.e. it was a Pesach and now you're changing it to be a shlomim, and you're doing that outside of the Azara, that doesn't count. You have to be slaughtering this korban in the Azara and have the intention that I'm specifically slaughtering this not as a korban Pesach, but rather as a korban shlomim because it's Shayim Mos Hashana. At that point, it changes names from being a Pesach to being a shlomim. But if you do the same thing but outside of the Azara, it doesn't work. It doesn't change the korban from being a Pesach to being a shlomim. And therefore, it's as though you slaughtered a korban Pesach outside of the Azara, b'shari Mos Hashana, in which case you would not be chayiv for Shehutay hutz. You'd be potter for Shehutay hutz. Great. Kiyasa Ravin, when Ravin came, he said the exact opposite. Rabbi Yirmiyah, Rabbi Yochanan, he said in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah, the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Pesach sheshachato b'chutz b'shari Mos Hashana. If you have a korban Pesach that you slaughter outside of the Azara, the rest of the day, the rest of the year, Bein lishmo, whether you slaughter it l'shem korban Pesach, bein shelo lishmo, whether you slaughter it l'shem shlomim, chayiv. So Ravin says in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah, in the name of Rabbi Dimi, that you take a chayiv even if you slaughter it with the intention of a korban Pesach, which is the wrong korban. You're still going to be chayiv for Shehutay hutz. Va'afilu lishmo, and even if you're slaughtering this korban, the Shem Pesach, outside of the Azara and Shayim Mos Hashana. But but 1 second, what about the following Mishnah? Mehusar zeman. If you have an animal that is lacking the proper time, bein begufo bein bebailim, whether it's because it is too young, it's not yet 8 days old. The pasuk says that for the first week it stays with its mother. After that, starting from day 8, it could be a korban. So if you have an animal that's too young, or bein bebailim, or whether the person bringing the korban is not yet ready to be bringing the korban. What's an example of a person who's not yet ready to bring a korban. Hazav v'azava v'yoledes v'amitzora. For example, a zav, that hasn't yet had 7 days without ziva, or a zava, or a yoledes, or a mitzora. These are people that aren't ready immediately to offer their korbanos. They have to wait until after a certain event, whether they haven't seen some kind of a mission, or whether, a yoledes is just after 40 days for a boy, 80 days for a girl, kilu. Right? These are people that they have to bring korbanos after a certain amount of time, but they cannot bring their korbanos before then. So if they offer, right, because at least as Rashi points out, that the asham is specifically by a mitzora, but these korbanos, right, the chatos, asham that these people bring. So if they, right, because these are, right, in all of these cases they bring multiple korbanos, right? So if they offered outside of the Azara, when they were not yet able to offer these korbanos, because they weren't yet, whether, day 8 of Mitzorah, whatever it is, day 40 or day 80 of Yoledes, Peturin. So when it comes to the korban chatas and the korban asham, they're going to be pater for shchutei chutz. Olosein v'shlamein b'chutz chayavin. If they slaughter their korban ola or their korban shlamim outside of the azara, then they're going to be chayiv because for shchutei chutz, because a ola or a shlamim, even though they can't offer, let's say a mitzora, so he can't offer his ola and his shlamim or yoledes, whatever. Right? They all have different korbanos. I don't know that a mitzora brings a shlamim, it brings a chatas, an asham, and an ola. Anyways, we got a whole bunch of different people, a whole bunch of different korbanos. But when it comes to those who need to bring a shlamim, or I think all of them probably bring an ola, so those can also be brought as an adava. So even though you can't, so let's say our mitzora who's bringing a ola at least. So even though he can't offer his ola as a mitzora, because he's not yet pure, but a nedava, right? An animal can still be offered as an nedava, and it's a little bit confusing because Rashi points out that actually technically an ola can't bring a mitzora can't bring a korban because he's a mitzora. So Rashi points out, well, say it's a nazir. However, there's a lot of details over here. You got lots of moving pieces. You got mitzoras and now nazirs and yoledes and zav and zava, and you got a chatos and an ashram and an ola and a shlamim. So just assume that we're somehow piecing it together and making these questions make sense to the extent that we're saying, so basically when it says, if they bring their asham or a chatas, it's talking about any of the listed people who are shaykh to an asham or a chatas. And when it says ola and shlamim, assume that it's any people on the list who are shaykh to an ola and a shlamim. Okay, so let's just work with that and get back to our program, which is that we're talking about chatases, ashams, olas, and shlamims outside of the azar. So we had said that when it comes to the chatas and the asham, so if you offer it outside of the azara, you are right. These people, they offer it outside of the azara when they are not yet supposed to be offering it because their time period is not up. Each one of these people has a specific time period. Their time period is not yet up. So if they offer a asham or a chatas, so before this time, so they are going to be pater because a chatas and an asham. Let's just keep it at that for now, actually. You're going to be pater for a chatas and an asham, but we're saying that you're going to be chayev for an ola or a shlamim, because even though the specific ola or shlamim that they're supposed to be bringing for their predicament, mitzora, nazir, whatever it might be, but so it's premature for that, but since you can always offer an ola or a shlamim as a nidava, as a voluntary offering, so therefore we'll consider it an animal that could be offered now, and therefore you're going to be chayav for shchutei chutz. Right, so olosein v'shlamein b'chutz chayavin. They're going to be chayav for shchutei chutz for an ola or for a shlamim. V'amar Rav Chilkiah bar Tuvi, and Rav Chilkiah bar Tuvi clarifies, well, as clear as things can get given the context. Lo shanu ella lishmo. When we say that by a chatas and an asham, you're going to be pater for shchutei chutz, that is only when offered as a chatas or an asham, because the chatas and the asham are not yet ready to be offered. However, aval shelo lishmo chayev. But if you offer them, let's say as a shlamim or something, you're going to be chayav, or as an ola, you'll be chayav. Because as Rashi points out, that if you slaughter a korban shelo lishmo with the wrong intention, so even though you won't be yotzei for bringing the korban if you had to bring it, so let's say korban chatas, you still have to bring another korban chatas, but you could still put it on the mizbeach. It still works as a korban, just you're not yotzei whatever korban you had to bring. So therefore, when it comes to this chatas and this asham that were slaughtered too early, because the people bringing them are not yet ready to bring them, so if they offer them as a chatas or an asham, so then they'll be pater because they're not yet ready to be offered as a chatas or an asham. However, if they're offered as some other animal, let's say an ola, well then you'll be chayav. Since technically you can, right, if you can offer it as a ola, as an adava, as a voluntary offering, and if you slaughter a chatas as an ola, it technically it's technically a korban. You still have to bring a separate korban to be yotzei for your chatas, but it can be offered. So therefore, you'll be chai for shehutay hutz. Lishma miya pater. Lishma miya pater. But what do we see? What do we see, Chaver? We see that when you slaughter a chatas or an asham, right, these people, they prematurely slaughter a chatas or an asham as a chatas or an asham, lishma, so they're going to be pater for shehutay hutz, because you can't yet offer these animals. But ve'amai? Why? Because after all, Ravin is arguing in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that when it comes to Korban Pesach, on some other day of the year, that you slaughter as a Korban Pesach, which is the wrong Korban, because on the other days of the year, you have to offer it as a shlamim, so you offer it as the wrong korban outside of the azara, and Ravin is saying that you're chayav. But over here we seem to be saying that in a Mishnah, that if you offer this chatas or this asham prematurely, you're pater. Amai nema ho'il v'ru'uin shelo lishmo bifnim. But why does the Mishnah say it's pater if, after all, Ravin is arguing by the Korban Pesach that since you could technically offer it as a Korban Shlamim inside the Beis HaMikdash, you can offer it as a Korban Shlamim, therefore you are chayav when it comes to Korban Pesach, so why doesn't the Mishnah say that by the Chatas and the Asham, you're also going to be chayav, even though you're slaughtering it, right, for slaughtering it outside of the Azara, even though you're not ready to bring it yet, since it could be offered as an ola. So the Gemara answers, so the Gemara answers that they're different. The reason why Ravin says that when it comes to a Korban Pesach, b'shayimos hashana, you're going to be chayav for shehutay hutz, even if you slaughter it as a Korban Pesach, which is the wrong animal, because a Pesach b'shayimos hashana is a shlamim. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to uproot anything. It is a shlamim. A Korban Pesach and the rest of the days of the year is a shlamim. Therefore, you don't have to do anything. It already is a shlamim, and therefore, memela, when you slaughter it outside of the Azara, you're chayav for slaughtering this korban, which is a shlamim that could be offered in the Azara. You're slaughtering it outside of the Azara, therefore you're chayav. However, when it comes to this korban chatas or asham of these people who are not yet ready to offer it, they would actually have to change it to be a different offering in order to be chayav, and therefore they're going to be pater, because if they do it, unless they are the ones who change it to be a different offering, it's going to be a chatas or an asham which is not yet ready to be offered, therefore going to be pater for shehutay hutz. Says the Gemara, Rav Ashi masni chayav. So Rav Ashi says that he's chayav, like Ravin, right? He's got like Ravin that Pesach b'shayimos hashana outside of the Azara, you're chayav, whether it's the shem Pesach or the shem shlamim. Rav Yirmiyah midifti masni pater, whereas Rav Yirmiyah midifti says that you're pater like Rav Dimi, because kasaver Pesach b'shayimos hashana by Akira, because like Rav Dimi explained, or really Rav Yirmiyah explained the name to Rav Dimi, that the Korban Pesach, the rest of the days of the year, you have to uproot it from being a Pesach to being a Shlomim. V'akiras chutz lav shma akira. And akiras chutz, uprooting the name from a Shlomim to be from a Pesach to a Shlomim outside of the Azara is not really considered uprooting, and therefore remains a Pesach, and that's why you're potter. Ufliga to Rav Chilkir Bar Tuvi, and that of course argues on Rav Chilkir Bar Tuvi, who said that when it comes to this, he clarifies by the Ashram and the Shlomim that is premature, that if you slaughter it l'shem Ola, you taka be chayav for Shehutay chutz. So clearly he says that Akira outside of the Azara is Akira. So Rav Yirmiyah Difti would argue on that. Okay. Omar Mar. Going back to the end of the daf yesterday, what did we say? Mishahigril alein. So if you have the two goats, and you already drew the lotteries, so now one is a Sar L'Hashem, one is a Sar L'Azazel. Chayav al shel shem. So if you now slaughter the two goats outside of the Azara, you'll be chayav for the Sa'ir L'Hashem, because it's already been designated to be offered inside the Azara as a Korban Chatas. And now you slaughtered it outside of the Azara, so you're chayav. Ufarta ashal Azazel. And you'll be potter for slaughtering the Azazel. You'll be the Sa'ir L'Azazel. You'll be potter for slaughtering it outside of the Azara for Shehutay chutz, because it wasn't going to be offered in the Azara anyways. It was going to be dropped off a cliff. Tanur Rabbanan Chever, the rabbis taught, Ish. Now really we're just quoting a pasuk over here. Ish mi Beis Yisrael, a fellow from Yid, Asher Yishchat Shoro Kesef Weiz B'machne, that he slaughters a ox or a sheep or a goat in the camp, or Asher Yishchat Mechutz L'machne, or he slaughters outside of the camp. El Pesach Oyel Moed Lo Evio. Lack of Korban Hashem, and he didn't bring it to the Mishkan to offer as a Korban. So right, it's talking about, of course, an animal that was set aside to be a Korban. It's hektish. You set it aside as or you mekadesh it as a Korban, makdish it as a Korban, and you slaughter it outside of the Azara. Shehutay chutz that we've been talking about. Oh, Korban. So when it says that if it's a Korban, right, what does it say? It says right, shor kezav oezo where am I? Bama, what the asher yishchat shor kezav oezo b'machne, etc. It says right, lahakriv korban laHashem. Shomea ani afilu kachi bedek habayish nikru korban. So I may have had the ability to say, you know what else is included in the prohibition of Shehutay chutz? Even animals that have been set aside as bedek habayis, that you designate to the Beis Hamikdash, not necessarily to offer as a korban, but that you designate to the Beis Hamikdash. Shenikru korban, that we see that bedek habayis is also referred to as a korban. Ka'iner chenemar, as the pasuk says, "Vanakrev es korban Hashem," and we offered the offering of God, and it explains, gold and silver and all sorts of exciting things like this. Actually, does it say? Yeah, it says gold, bracelets. Very fun things. So it's talking about bedek habayis, and it's calling it a korban, right? Things that were donated to the temple, money, value, objects, and yet they're called a korban. So I might think that if I set aside an animal not as a korban but to donate to the Beis Hamikdash, so I might think that also those, if I slaughter it outside the Azara, I'll be chayav for Shehutay chutz. Talmud Omer B'al Pesach Ol Moed Lo Evio. It says in the context of Shehutay chutz that the problem is that he did not bring it to the entrance to the Ol Moed. Kol haroy lefesach Ol Moed chayav olav b'chutz. So anything that is fit to be slaughtered as a korban inside the Ol Moed, you're chayav for Shehutay chutz. Kol she'enu roy lefesach Ol Moed ein chayav olav b'chutz. And anything that is not fit for the entranceway of the Ol Moed, so then you're potter for Shehutay chutz, and therefore this bedek habayis, if you set aside an animal for bedek habayis, so you're not going to be offering it as a korban, and therefore you're potter for Shehutay chutz. Otzi elu, so now correct the Gemara, Otzi elu she'en ru'uyin lefesach Ol Moed. So I'll say, okay, fine. So we exclude bedek habayis. If I set aside an animal for bedek habayis, I'll be potter for Shehutay chutz. But velo otzi, skip the next two words. Rashi says skip them. Sorry, mishtaleach, but I will not exclude, double negative, Sar Amishtalech, meaning, I'll say that Sar Amishtalech, the goat that gets dropped off the cliff, I'll be chayav for Shehutay chutz. We had said they'd be potter for the Sar Amishtalech since it's not actually offered in the Beis HaMikdash, but I'll think that actually, I might have the opportunity to say that I'll be chayav for Shehutay chutz by the Sar Amishtalech. Because after all, it does go into the Azar. It's not slaughtered in the Azar, it's dropped off a cliff. But we bring it into the Azar for the lotteries. You do vidui, do confession on it. So Tamalom ala Hashem. So if the pasuk says to the Eibishter, Mishimuchadin la Hashem, that which is specific for God, Yatsu elu she'em miuchadim la Hashem. To the exclusion of the Sar La'azazel, which is not specifically to God, meaning it doesn't get slaughtered in the Beis HaMikdash. For God, it gets dropped off a cliff. Okay, so we see that the Sar La'azazel is excluded from the prohibition of Shehutay chutz. So, okay, and therefore, if you slaughter after the lottery, you slaughter both goats outside of the Azara, so you'll be chayiv for the Sar L'Hashem, you'll be potter for the Sar L'Azazel. V'Lashem l'hotziu, frakti Gemara. We just use the word L'Hashem to exclude Sar L'Azazel from Shehutay chutz. But is L'Hashem a word, is it a construct that is exclusionary? V'Aminu, I'll bring you a proof to say that L'Hashem actually is inclusionary. It says about by mehusar zeman. Right? What does the pasuk say, Chevre? If you have an ox or a sheep or a goat that will be born, that for the first 7 days of its life, it hangs out with its mother from day 8 and forward. It could be offered as a korban to God. So it says, elu ishim. So these are animals that are offered on the mizbeach, right, on the fire. How do I know that we shouldn't set them aside when they are not yet 8 days old? Tamalomer korban. Okay, it says as a korban. Fine. La Hashem l'Abu Sar Mishtalech. And when it says La Hashem, it's to include the Sar Mishtalech. Meaning, when it says Ishe, so I would think only things that go on the Mizbeach, you have to make sure that they have to be at least 8 days old. But if you have, let's say, the Sar Mishtalech, which doesn't go on the Mizbeach, it gets dropped off a cliff, so I might think that even an animal that's less than 8 days old, you could drop it off the cliff. So therefore it says La Hashem, L'Rabu Sar Mishtalech. So it says no, La Hashem even includes the Sar Mishtalech. So on the one hand, we wanted to say a minute ago that La Hashem excludes the Sar Mishtalech from Shehutay chutz, and yet we seem to be saying that La Hashem includes the Sar L'Azazel in mehusar zeman. So Chevra, what do you think? Is La Hashem exclusionary or inclusionary? If this was Instagram, I guess we could probably put like a vote. And then we can all vote, and tomorrow we could say who wins. So Rava says, you have to look at the context of the pasuk. You have to take the bigger picture into what's the word? Into account, or whatever, consideration. Hasam del Pesach lirabos la Hashem lootzi. In the context of Shehutay chutz, it says vel Pesach o Moed lo evio, that I would think that anything that you bring to the entranceway of the Ol Moed would be included, including the Sar L'Hashem, because it goes into the Azara for the lottery and for the vidui. So I might think that Sar Mishtalech is included in Shehutay chutz. Therefore, I needed the word La Hashem to say, no, don't include it, exclude it. But in this case, in the context of mehusar zeman, when it says Ishe, that it needs to be something that goes on the Mizbeach, something that goes on fire, which excludes the Sar Mishtalech, which doesn't go on a fire, you drop it off a cliff. So in this case, where Sari Mishtalech is going to be excluded, well then what does La Hashem do? Includes it. So La Hashem the Rabos. So it depends on the context. Okay, fine. So we've answered that. And what have we concluded? We've concluded that Sari Mishtalech is excluded from Shehutay hutz, and it is included in the requirement to wait 8 days. Now, frag the Gemara. Time the Rabbi Rachmana, Halo Rabbi, have Amina Sari Mishtalech, Kodesh b'mehusar zeman. Chavi, you hear the kasha? Let's read it again. Time of the Rabbi Rachmana is the reason really that we say that by the Sari Mishtalech, the goat that's dropped off the cliff, so we say that it needs to be at least 8 days old. If it's less than 8 days old, you can't drop it off the cliff. Why? Because the pasuk says La Hashem, to include even the Sari Mishtalech by mehusar zeman. Halo Rabbi, but if we didn't have the word La Hashem, Hava Amina, would I really have entertained the notion that Sari Mishtalech Kodesh b'mehusar zeman, that you can have a goat that you're setting aside to drop off the cliff when it's less than a week old? Why would that even enter my mind? But the lottery only works for an animal that can be offered as a korban chatas for God. Right? Meaning, you're taking these two animals. That's kind of the whole point of a lottery. You don't know which one's going to be which. So you take two animals. Now either one could end up being the one that's offered as the korban chatas in the lifnai v'lifnim on Yom Kippur. And therefore, for that korban, it's going to have to be at least 8 days old. And therefore, how could I have the havamina to say that the goat that I drop off the cliff can be less than a week old? Because after all, in advance, at the time that we're setting it aside, we don't know that it's going to be the one that you drop off the cliff. It depends on the lottery. And therefore, since it's dependent on the lottery, there's an equal chance that it might end up being the one that is slaughtered in the Azara and offered by the Kohen Gadol. In which case, we need that both animals that we're bringing to the lottery have to be at least 8 days old so that they could potentially be the Sari Lashem. So why would I have the Havamina to say that if not for the fact that La Hashem includes the Sari Mishtaleach in the requirement of 8 days, well, if not for the inclusion, I would have thought that by the Sari Mishtaleach it could be less than 8 days, but how is that technically possible? Because in order for it to become a Sari Mishtaleach, it has to go through a lottery. And the whole point of a lottery is that it can go either way, which means that this animal might end up being the Sari Lashem. And the Sari Lashem certainly has to be a week old. So how does it even enter our mind that we can get to a situation where we have an animal that's less than a week old, less than 8 days old, that's being the Sari Mishtaleach? How would that even ever come to be, since it would have to be at least a week old coming into the lottery? So the answer, of course, is going to be to create some kind of ukimta where there's not going to be a lottery. Rav Yosef says, Rav Yosef, Hamani Chanun Amitzri. So Rav Yosef says, well, the author of this brisa that says that I need the pasuk, I need the word La Hashem to include the Sari Mishtaleach in the requirement to be at least 8 days old. So I'll say that the author of that price is Chanun HaMitzri, who says that you don't need a lottery. And therefore, since you don't need a lottery, so then you don't have to worry about it maybe being the Sari Lashem. Let's see. The Tanya is, we learn in a brisa. Chanun HaMitzri, Omer says, Chanun HaMitzri, afilu dam bekos, maybe chaviro mezavig lo. Says Chanun HaMitzri, that if you have, so you add these two animals, one La Hashem, one La Azazel, and then you slaughter the Sari La Hashem, and now you have all the blood for the Sari La Hashem, and you're going to start using it, and then the Sari La Azazel dies. So it says Chanun HaMitzri, well, maybe Chaver Mezaviglo, so just bring another goat to be the Sari Mishtaleach, and go weiter. You don't have to spill the blood on the floor. You already slaughtered the Sari Lashem. Now the Sari Lazazel dies, so he says just bring another one to be the Sari Lazazel, implying, or what the Gemara wants to assume that means, is that there's no additional lottery. There's no lottery. You just bring another one and go weiter. There's no lottery. And that one I may have had the havmina to say that it could be less than a week old. So therefore I need the pasuk of Hashem to include the sar mishtalech to say no, this additional one needs to be 8 days and older. But Ema de Shamas l'chon mitzvah de leisei dechuyin to leisei agral mishamas. But the Gemara says, wait, it's not so clear that Chon Mitzri says that you don't need a lottery. Maybe you bring it and do another lottery. Meaning, this is as opposed. Meaning, okay, it could be that Chon Mitzri is not saying that a lottery is not required. Maybe all that Chanan HaMitzri is saying is that you don't have to spill the blood on the floor. We saw in our Mishnah that according to Rabbi Yehuda, Meis HaMishtaleach Yishafech Adam. According to Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah, if the Sari Mishtaleach drops dead, so the blood that you have from the Sari Lashem that you already slaughtered, you have to spill out and start all over, bring a new Sari Lashem, new Sari Lazazel, start over. Perhaps Chanan HaMitzri is only arguing on Rabbi Yehuda and saying, no, you don't have to spill out that blood. That blood is fine. You just need to replace the Sari Lazazel. And how would you replace it? Offers the Gemara. Perhaps the way you would replace it is by bringing another 2 animals, do another lottery. The one that is Sari Lazazel replaces the one that died, and the other one, goes and grazes, or whatever you do with the additional one. But maybe all he's saying is that he's just disagreeing with Rabbi Yehuda, who says that you're going to have to spill the blood on the floor if the Sari Lazazel dies. And Chanan HaMitzri is saying, no, you don't. Just replace the Sari Lazazel. But perhaps he says that how do you replace the Sari Lazazel? With a lottery. And if that's the case, I would need it, Mimele, to be at least a week old, because when it comes to the lottery, you don't know which one's going to be Lashem, which one's Lazazel, and Lashem certainly is going to have to be at least a week old. So therefore, still, I don't know why I would need the pasuk of La Hashem to include Sar Lazazel in the requirement to be at least 8 days old. Memela, I would need it for the lottery. So Elam Rav Yosef rather says Rav Yosef, Hamani Rav Shimoni. Rather, the author of the Brisa, who learns out from the Riboy of La Hashem, that the Sar Lazazel needs to be at least 8 days old. It's Rav Shimon de Tanya, as we learn in the Brisa, Meis Echad Me'en, Maybe Chaver Shalo Ba'agrala Divrei Reb Shimon. The Reb Shimon's opinion is that if one of the goats dies, so then you bring a second one and you don't have to do a lottery. And therefore, in the event that the Sar Lazazel dies, you could just replace the Sar Lazazel, no lottery required. And therefore, I need the pasuk to say that replacement one has to be at least a week old. Okay. Ravina Amar, Ravina suggests, Kigon Shehumam V'chilalo Al Acher. You hear that? Ravina suggests that the case where you wouldn't need a lottery is where you had 2 goats, one Lashem, one Lazazel, and then after you did the lottery, the Sari Lazazel developed a mum. And now that it has a blemish, it cannot be dropped off the cliff. And in this case, what you do is, so now you have this goat that's Lazazel, it has a mum, so you transfer its kedusha onto a different animal that you'll now use as the Sar Lazazel. And that new one, you don't have to do a lottery, you just merely transfer the kedusha from the animal that was already determined through a lottery to be the Sar Lazazel. You transferred its status onto a new animal, and that animal just takes it on without a lottery. And I might think that animal could be less than a week old, therefore we have the pasuk to say no, it has to be at least a week old. Now the Gemara wants to know, wait, how do I know this, by the way? How do I know that the Sar Lazazel cannot have a mum? The Tanya is we learn in a Brisa of Ishe lo sitnu mehem, that it says in the context of animals that have a mum, don't put them on the mizbeach. Elu achalavim, that's a reference to the fats. Einli ala kulon, all I know is all of the fats. Miktsasum minayin, how do I know that don't even put some of the fats on the mizbeach? Tam lomar, therefore the pasuk says mehem, even from them, even a subset of them, don't put these blemished animals on the mizbeach. Mizbeach zozuk, right? Al mizbeach zozukas damim. When it says on the mizbeach, that's referring to zrikas adam. La Hashem, l'rabu sarya mishtaleach. And when it says La Hashem, it's to include the Sarya Mishtaleach, to say that the Sarya Mishtaleach also must be unblemished. The pasuk, the Torah needed to teach us that a Sari Mishtalech must be unblemished. It also needed to teach us that the Sari Mishtalech must be at least 8 days old. Because of Achmana mehusar zeman, because if all we knew was that the Sari Mishtalech has to be at least 8 days old, Mishum de lo mati zmane, because it's not yet its time, it's not yet fit to be a korban. Have a ba'amum de mati zmane, but a ba'amum which is more than 8 days old, maybe that would be okay. Eimalo, I might think it's okay. V'ikas of Achmana ba'amum, and if the pasuk said that the Sari Mishtalech must be unblemished, Mishum de mais, because a blemished animal is disgusting. Have a mehusar zeman de lo mais, eimalo, but a mehusar zeman, which is young but it's not unblemished, maybe that would be okay. Sricha, therefore, we needed to teach that both a blemished animal as well as a mehusar zeman animal are unusable as a Sari Mishtalech. And to conclude today's daf, Rava Amar says, Rava kagon shahaya lo chole b'soch beiso v'shachat imo b'yom HaKippurim. You hear that, Kasha? The ukimta, where you can potentially have an animal that bypasses, Sari Mishtalech, that bypasses the lottery, and therefore I need a pasuk to teach me that it has to be at least 8 days old, would be that if you had a goat set aside as a Sari Mishtalech, but the fellow who supplies the goats to the Beis HaMikdash, he had somebody, chole sheyesh bo sakana, in his house on Yom Kippur, had somebody very ill in his house, and he needed to slaughter an animal to feed to this sick person on Yom Kippur. And which animal did he slaughter? He slaughtered the mother of the Sari Mishtalech. Now, the pasuk says, Osav es bino, lo tishchat b'yomecha. You're not allowed to slaughter a parent animal and a child animal on the same day. And therefore, even though the animal was set aside to be the Sari Mishtalech, since the mother was slaughtered on Yom Kippur to feed this sick person, so memele, then you can't drop the Sari Mishtalech off the cliff because of this requirement that you're not allowed to slaughter a parent and a child on the same day. So what do? So you replace the Sari Mishtalech with a different animal, and that would bypass the lottery, and I need the pasuk to teach me that that animal needs to be at least 8 days old. To which the Gemara says, wait, but the pasuk says don't slaughter an animal and its child on the same day. This isn't slaughtering, it's dropping off a cliff. In Eretz Yisrael they said, yeah, but in this context, dropping the animal off the cliff would be its slaughtering. That was the Samach Gimel of Masechta Yoma, a real daf of Gemara, huh? A real daf of Gemara. We had to use our head even a little bit there. So what do we learn about? Oh my goodness gracious. So we learned about the Korban Pesach outside of the Azar, Shehutay hutz. Really, which came up in the context of the opinion of Ho'il. Rav Chizda saying, this context of this concept of since. How does that tie into anything? Well, Rav Chizda says that when it comes to a Korban Pesach, not on the 14th day of Nisan, that you slaughter outside of the Azar. So he says, if you slaughter it l'shem Korban Pesach, which is the wrong animal, so you can be pater. If you do it l'shem shlamim, so then you're going to be chayiv. We said the default is that you would be pater. And we want to say, well, maybe you should say ho'il, but since it could be offered as a shlamim, maybe she would be chayiv. To which he says, yeah, but you need akira, and you didn't uproot it to be a shlamim, you just had a stam intent, a default intention, so therefore it's going to be pater. Then we saw the opinion of Rav Dimi, who says that whether you slaughter the Korban Pesach and the rest of the year as a Pesach or as a Shlam, you're going to be pater. So we see that even if you slaughter as a Pesach, that even if you slaughter as a Shlamim, you're still going to be pater, even though it could technically be brought as a Shlam that day. The reason is because he says that Akira, uprooting the animal from a Pesach to a Shlam outside of the Azar, is not really an Akira, and therefore you're going to be pater. Ravin says the opposite, which is that if you slaughter a Korban Pesach on a different day of the year, whether as a Korban Pesach, whether as a Shlam, you're going to be chayiv. So we see even if you slaughter as a Pesach, you're going to be chayiv, because he holds, which is the wrong animal, that Pesach, a Korban Pesach, the rest of the days of the year is memele a Shlamim, and therefore when you offer it, you're offering it as a Shlam, and therefore you're going to be chayiv. For Shehutay hutz. Then we got into the sugya of, one second, so that was, okay, Shehutay hutz, okay, and we see that, the Lazazel also is an issue of Shehutay hutz. Yeah, exactly. Great. Then we get into mehusar zeman, which is an animal that is not yet 8 days old. So, we say that applies to the Sar Lazazel as well. That an animal that's right, the Sar Lazazel, the Sar Mishtaleach, needs to be at least 8 days old, and we learn it from a pasuk. The question is, why do I need the pasuk? I know it memele because it's only established as the Sar Lazazel by way of a lottery, which means that it could equally end up as the Sar Lashem. The Sar Lashem certainly has to be 8 days old. So we have to find different ukimtos where there's not going to be a lottery. Rav Yosef says that, well, because the Brisa that establishes by a pasuk that the Sar Mishtaleach needs to be at least 8 days old, is Reb Shimon, who says that if the Sar Mishtaleach dies, you just bring a replacement without a lottery. So it has to be at least 8 days old. Ravina says that it could be a situation where the Sar Mishtaleach develops a blemish, in which case you just replace, you transfer its holiness onto a different animal without the need of a lottery, so that animal would have to be 8 days old. And Rava says it could be talking about a situation where you had to slaughter the mother of the Sar Mishtaleach on Yom Kippur to feed a deathly ill person, so therefore you can no longer drop the Sar Mishtaleach off the cliff, since its mother was slaughtered that day already, so therefore they bring a replacement without a lottery, and that would also have to be 8 days old. Chevret, that was Daf Samach Gimel, a real, a real thinker of a daf. Anyways, Chevret, I hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day. Cheers.